Modern society is artificial, hypocritical, completely saturated with slop, and frankly, miserable. This is a video about the book that saw all of that in 1951. Catcher in the Rye is a book of the type that I like to call observing books. These are books that were written by keenly observant authors who were witnessing certain ailments begin to take hold of their worlds, whether it was society at large or just the part of it with which they were most familiar. These authors rarely offer solutions to the problems that they have noticed. Solutions are not really the business of novelists, not always. And even when novelists offer solutions, it's often so oblique that it can't be explicitly seen, at least not until the exact moment it's needed. Observing books differ from dystopian stories. Books like 1984 and Brave New World are offering warnings about what current society could become if left uncorrected. Observing books offer no warnings. They are the bare-faced truth about what was happening in their times. And to a like-minded reader, they come across like keenly prescient insights into the specific ills plaguing their times and future times. A lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time, a very well-written observing book will accidentally stumble upon precisely the issues that could go on to create the broken society of the future that its writer could not have foreseen. As an aside, this is why observation is the most powerful tool of any writer. The way I look at it, observing books are kind of the first wave. Society begins to fall ill, and then these sharp-eyed souls, these keenly observant creative types, can't help but write stories in which their characters are also observing these hairline fractures and the weight-bearing beams of civilization and culture. Later, and sometimes even concurrently, other novelists who have made similar observations, sometimes even bolstered by those of the observing books, will write their dystopian warnings. Of course, there are always the other books, and then there are even the escapist books like fantasy or romance, but certain points in history produce the right circumstances to give us exactly the right authors to write that era's observing books. Observing books and the dystopian books of a given era work together to help a society both observe its own ills and also metabolize and adjust to the new normal, for good or ill. For this reason, the very best of these types of books become a source of profound comfort, contrary to what might seem logical, largely because they allow an isolated reader to feel that he or she isn't insane or alone. Moments in history when massive changes occur in society are often met with very quiet waves of profound pain by people who can see what the world is becoming. These books become lifelines to these types of people. J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye observed the world of post-war society in America, and these observations, contrary to what one would believe, were not particularly flattering. We in our times tend to think of post-war America as a kind of paradise. We had won the war and defeated big bad Hitler. There was a lot less crime, houses were affordable, families tended to stay together, people had stronger moral fiber, a good education was actually a good education. But as I've talked about before, a lot of what we in current year know about the past isn't necessarily true, or at least it isn't the whole picture. For Zoomers born into a world dominated by explicit content addiction, social media addiction, artificiality, AI, isolation and lack of human interaction, mental health and prescription med crises, academic decline, skyrocketing crime, nightmarish economic situations, and a general hopeless, purposeless existence, the world of the 50s in America might as well have been another planet. Would it then surprise you to know that 1950s America carried the seeds for all of our present social ailments? The post-World War II planet was one that was in a chaotic, unstable, uncertain state of flux. The idea of civilization was changing. The idea of culture was changing. The idea of heroes and idols was changing. The idea of family and husband and wife and children and school and hard work and religion and even hope were all changing. And it would be some time before people got a handle on what the new normal would be. A lot of books written in this country in those times spoke of some of these pains, yes, but few of them, perhaps none of them, so perfectly encapsulated not just what was wrong, but what was coming in the way that J.D. Salinger's book did. Just as a highly oversimplified rundown of the ideas here, There might have been less crime in America in the 1950s, but teenage crime was on the rise. Houses might have been more affordable, but the growing power of the mortgage was going to set up the system that gave us the crash of 2008, and the next crash that's certainly around the corner. Families tended to stay together, maybe, but divorce was on the rise. And meanwhile, things like swinger parties or key parties were growing in popularity, which is to say, the marriage unit might have stayed together, but the union of husband and wife was at an all-time low. People might have had stronger moral fiber compared to now, but it was declining in those days when postmodernism and moral relativism were becoming increasingly vogue. And even though you could still get a good education, as Holden and Caulfield observed in The Catcher in the Rye, to what end? So you can graduate from your excellent college and plunge yourself into a lifetime of meaningless materialism? That meaningless materialism was probably the hallmark of Western civilization at that time. So much so that even the authors of Japanese observing books like Dazai Osamu and Yukio Mishima noticed the toxic fruits of this infection of Japanese society. Another more recent example of an observing book relevant to any millennials out there is Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club. For Palahniuk, as any millennial knows, the 90s and early 2000s were changing Western civilization in ways we wouldn't fully appreciate for another 20 years. More than that, Palahniuk was also observing the outcome of similar changes that had carried society from the post-war era, changes from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s that had brought us to where things were in the late 90s. For instance, Palahniuk was one of the most popular Western writers of the 90s and early aughts to point out in a way that really caught on that our Western society was increasingly a fatherless one. It might have taken a while, but that got started in the 1950s. Parentlessness in general got started in the 1950s, something else that Salinger observed. In The Catcher in the Rye, only Holden Caulfield's mother makes an appearance, and then Holden only hears her, he doesn't see her, and his father never makes an appearance in the entire book. Almost all the major observing books were incredibly controversial when they came out, and some still are today. Turkey's The Disconnected by Atay, Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, Dazai's No Longer Human. Many of these books' respective societies seem to take umbrage with their depiction. Ironically, people feared that these books' characters would influence bad behavior in their impressionable young readers. Ironic, because those who stated these concerns seemed oblivious to the fact that the societies they had built and were trying so stolidly to protect were, in large part, producing these undesirable types of behavior and characteristics, which most of the time is precisely what the authors were trying to convey. But let's return to our topic today, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. This is a book that emerged in America when victory and peacetime and prosperity had allowed society to enter a kind of optimistic contentment that blinded people to the reality of life. Culture had already changed and was changing more and more every year. Some changes were good, some were neutral, and some were poison, threatening civilization. Salinger's aim with the book was not, I don't think, to show this to the world. He merely told a story about society as he saw it. However, his observations were so keen and so surgical that readers felt like he had an almost supernatural capacity to understand the growing alienation young people of the time were feeling within this new society. Remember, post-war America might have been one of patriotism and shared values and all the rest of that on the surface, but it was also a world of increased alcoholism, nervous conditions, psychoanalysis, casual drug use, sexual promiscuity, pop culture hero worship, complex politics, complex morality, and all the rest of it. This was not a stable or peaceful time, culturally speaking. JFK was assassinated only 12 years after this book came out. And then Vietnam, and then Woodstock, and don't forget the Korean War, the Cold War, the draft, and on and on. For those of you who haven't read it, the story follows troubled kid Holden Caulfield, who has just been expelled from Pensy Prep, an exclusive boarding school, because he's flunking 4 of his 5 classes. When I say troubled, I don't mean it how we tend to mean it now. You know, a kid who might end up being the next school shooter. By troubled, I mean that his mind is uneasy, he's depressed, and he doesn't completely understand why. He's unsettled, hopeless, aimless, and purposeless. So instead of waiting for Christmas break to leave school, he decides to leave quietly and return home to New York 3 days early so he can spend those days alone before facing his parents' wrath. However, along the way, he experiences a prolonged, quiet crisis that is impossible to resolve. Salinger probably wasn't trying to say any particular thing with this novel, but he was observing the reality of society. The reality that most people really really didn't like to be shown. And as the years marched on and the book only grew in popularity, people of that generation, people who were determined to cling to the idea that everything was fine and society was all normal, sound familiar? Were eager to condemn, if not the book itself, at least the way in which it was interpreted. While Holden experiences 3 extremely lonely, difficult days in New York, he shares with the reader his observations about the world, about himself, about what he wants for his future, about his friends and the people he dislikes, and about his family. As plots go, not much happens. But it is with these observations that Salinger tells the reader the story he wants to tell, which is a kid losing hope in society and being unable to determine if the fault is with society or himself. In a desperate attempt at survival near the climax of the novel, Holden decided to abandon everything and run away to the west to become a ranch hand in Colorado so he could earn enough money to build himself a nice cabin in the woods somewhere. Once that was done, he would find himself a nice, like-minded wife, and they would have kids, and they would keep their kids hidden away from the toxicity of modern society. We already know from the opening chapter that he doesn't succeed. The book is written from inside a sanitarium, a mental institution where Holden is being treated while he awaits release back into the real world, which is perhaps the cruelest lesson Salinger has to teach us, but we'll get to that in a minute. It would take several videos to detail all the things Holden noticed, but let's highlight some standouts. Few things irritated Holden Caulfield more than what he calls being phony. The phoniness he describes as examples throughout the book are similar to the two-faced dishonesty that so deeply troubled Yozo, the narrator of Dazai Osamu's No Longer Human. Both he and Caulfield possessed the germs of basic honesty and even integrity, and yet were subjected to a ceaseless torrent of meaningless phoniness from childhood. Both marked this feature of society as the most incomprehensible. Holden even observed that he found it terribly depressing. Dazai's narrator grudgingly embraced this social custom, pretending every day to be something he wasn't, in order to hide the truth he saw every single day. And he regarded this as among his greatest shames. Even Holden was paranoid about slipping into this himself. Some reviewers observed this in his repeated insistence to the reader that he really meant whatever it was he was saying. Things like, "I mean it, I really do. It was true, it really was." That kind of thing, over and over and over again. This phoniness and hypocrisy and lack of sincerity, lack of integrity, and ability to face things seriously, all of it wore Holden down very quickly. Contrary to what mid-century lore, the boomer lore, if you'd like, has taught us, being subjected to a constant fire hose of ambient, seemingly harmless, day-to-day artificiality and hypocrisy does not, in fact, build character. For many people, especially those who could have become extraordinary, it has a corrosive effect. Dazai's narrator watched his life crumble despite his best intentions under the unmanageable weight of hopelessness and depression. Holden, 16 years old, standing on the brink of the rest of his life, desperate for purpose and meaning, was distraught at the simple realization that in a world in which everything was fake and meaningless, there was no purpose and probably no future. That probably seemed insane in 1951, right after the Allies had defeated the Nazis and all was presumably right with the world, but look at us now. Kids like Holden, and more specifically novelists like Salinger, clearly saw society's trajectory. Holden didn't see much hope for the future. And look around. Like Dazai's protagonist in No Longer Human, Holden could see under everyone's mask of fakeness, or phoniness, as he liked to say. And it didn't just irritate him or annoy him, it depressed him. Because Holden could see, even if he couldn't understand, just as Dazai's protagonist couldn't understand, that on a long enough timeline, that fakeness, that artificiality that was infesting society was going to destroy it, and it was going to make life not worth living. Imagine being 16, without much support from your parents, without much of anything real or stable to hang on to in society, or your family, or your life, and then you begin to see that, and you begin to realize that. I would imagine that most of you don't have to imagine. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Our current generation of low desire Zoomers are exactly what Holden and Salinger sensed was coming. Holden sensed it in himself, and it terrified him and depressed him. To him, giving into the hollow world that was waiting for him on the other side of a college education would be like walking off a cliff. Of course, there were many other observations Holden made. He saw how the world had become more and more obsessed with inconsequential, meaningless sex, even himself, and he believed Hollywood's slop was partly to blame. He also saw that plugging into the Hollywood slot machine was a kind of willful anesthetic against the hollowness of daily life, and that depressed him. That is to say, brain rot was something that really bothered him, and he even saw the effects of it in himself. Holden also perceived, though he had no way to articulate it explicitly, a kind of diminishing masculinity, or one that felt itself needing to overcompensate for some reason. Men had to show off their masculinity in phony ways rather than just behaving like men. And he also noticed the social and cultural preoccupation with things. Materialism seemed to be the main driving goal for most people, and to him that was profoundly hollow and empty. Sure, he wanted to be able to provide for a family, but he could see that there was no need for a Harvard business degree or a job at a corporate law firm to do that. It seemed to him that most people pursued elite educations for status, and so that they could drive the latest Cadillac or otherwise show off their wealth. That was peak phoniness to Holden Caulfield. And on and on. If you haven't, I suggest reading the book. It's remarkably insightful, and as I'm sure you can see, a bit prescient. At the time it came out, a lot of young people resonated with Holden Caulfield. Teenagers at that time could sense the rot in the glittering society of the 1950s and 60s, and like Holden, they felt the hopelessness, the despair, the desire to leave it behind. This naturally bothered people. Peter J. Seng, alarmed not just by the insane, widespread mega-popularity of the book that had persisted then for a full decade, but also by the way it was being read, set out in an essay in the December 1961 edition of College English to correct what he deemed to be widespread misinterpretation. To him, he found it not just false but also dangerous that people were seeing in Holden someone whose observations might have some merit. Seng thought it was bad that anyone could see Holden as anything other than a dumb, bad, immature kid refusing to come to terms with the adult world. An adult world which was, Seng would have us believe, totally fine and normal and even good. He goes as far as to twist various scenes into painting Holden as someone who merely hated old age and old people, despite the fact that he had great respect for respectable older people, even if he found some of their habits weird, like sitting around with their hairy, wrinkly chests exposed. I don't know, maybe Seng was mad because he liked sitting around with his hairy, wrinkly chest exposed. Seng claimed that Holden didn't see his own faults. Meanwhile, on every other page, he's describing yet another shortcoming or flaw of his that he acknowledges and tries to combat. The fact that he's a coward, the fact that he's aimless and purposeless, the fact that he's a spendthrift, the fact that he gets too wrapped up in his emotions, the fact that he's oversexed. If anything, an honest reading of the text would reveal that Holden is too hard on himself and too willing to overlook the flaws of others. Seng's insane analysis goes on to paint Holden as someone entirely different from how he was clearly and explicitly written. Here's an example. Early in the book, Holden learns that his sexually aggressive roommate is going on a date with Jane, a girl Holden knew from childhood, and this causes him tremendous anxiety. Seng accuses Holden of being upset merely because, Seng claimed, Holden believed Jane was his own property. Whereas in the text, it was plain as day that Holden was worried for Jane because his roommate had a tendency to violate boundaries and get aggressive with dates, and he feared for that with Jane, who was a sensitive girl, which was actually a pattern with Holden. He hated it when people had their innocence manipulated and their vulnerability violated. But Seng's analysis isn't a surprise. After all, like so many characters in Salinger's book, adult and teenager alike, he wasn't listening. I could go on listing all of the willful, deliberate misreadings Seng made of the text in order to make it fit his narrative, misreadings which were common then and still are today, but I think it's most important to understand what that narrative was. Seng believed, falsely, obviously, that Holden hated adults, full stop, and that Holden hated the perfectly fine and normal adult world because it was made up of adults, whom he hated, for no more reason than that they were adults. This, according to Seng, accounted for Holden's hatred of things like phoniness, over-sexualization, materialism, and so on. He only hated them because they were adult things, and Holden hated adults like some kind of a weirdo. Look at this freak, he just hates adults. Adults are perfect, what's his problem? Does any of this sound familiar to anyone? Seng also said that this explained Holden's fixation on the goodness of children. When any fool with hooked on phonics can read the same book Seng read and see that Holden's admiration for children was in their innocence and their lack of artificiality or pretense. He admired this wherever he saw it, whether in children or adults, and he did encounter a few adults who were like this. Although Seng refers to these adults as children surrogates, because to Peter Seng, and one assumes many, many others, being genuine and making an effort to be free of pretense or phoniness was the mark of a child. Was it that Seng didn't read the same book I did, or was something else going on there? Seng's anxious reframing of the novel reveals two things about his generation. First, they didn't understand the book or its protagonist because, like many characters that Holden interacted with, none of them listened to him. They merely interpreted his words to fit the narrative that pleased them. Second, Seng and his generation were eager to quash any rising dissatisfaction with the status quo. To the Boomer generation, life literally could not have been better than it was in the years when Salinger's book was experiencing its first surge of culture-defining popularity. Seng and his generation would be the ones to mortgage the nation into shocking amounts of debt while basking in so-called prosperity that would leave their children and their children's children with a husk of a future. The Boomer generation didn't understand why their kids didn't think that their wildly materialistic, increasingly debauched post-war America wasn't the Garden of Eden that they thought it was. As the book took hold in America, it even became required reading in some schools, which I think is insane. This is a difficult book and a mature one, and not one I would require anyone to read, especially your average teenager. Sometimes I think they made it required reading so future generations would come to hate it instead of relating to it. But anyway, some parents took issue with it being in schools, which is certainly their right, but their problems with it were mainly that Holden was a bad role model because he refused to accept reality and he refused to grow up. Holden was critical of their world, and so he was bad. An article written in 1976 highlighted an idea that socially adjusted adults reading the book had begun to fixate on, that Holden was merely feeling alienated from society. In this type of story, alienation from society stories have existed for a long time. Stories like Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, The Metamorphosis by Kafka, a lot of the work of Albert Camus, Buddenbrooks, Notes from the Underground, and so on and so on. Almost always, these types of stories are thought of and spoken about within this nice, safe, contained subgenre, alienation from society, which allows people, I think, to believe that this is a problem more with the person than anything else, as if such a thing is an affliction that can randomly infect the person and is otherwise entirely neutral. There is hardly ever any real discourse about the nature of the society from which the character feels alienated. And that's the most important element of any story of this type. That 1976 article was a psychology article that tied Holden Caulfield in so many weird psychological knots that all amounted to how he felt was just more or less his own problem and had nothing to do with the reality in which he was forced to live. Because, of course, the alternative is that something is wrong with the world, too, and that's a thought that cannot be tolerated. My guess is that many of you already have heard things here that sound familiar, things that sound like the very issues you personally have encountered in your lives. Holden's observations and the bizarre and strangely telling ways in which they were willfully misinterpreted are still immensely relevant today, and it would seem they grow more and more relevant with each passing generation. Any Zoomer today, and most of the rest of us too, have experienced an increasingly hopeless outlook, not just in terms of financial stability or job prospects, but in a world where 5-year-olds are getting addicted to adult content and most adults are also addicted to it to some degree, a world where parents never take responsibility for their children, where the state goes out of its way to make sure kids and then teenagers and then young adults all get smashed and hammered into the exact same worker drone, where even a really good job isn't going to allow you to afford a mortgage, where social media is the only real life most people come into contact with, where people can't even talk to each other anymore, much less get to know each other, where materialism is shoved down our throats as the ultimate cure, where the tiniest flicker of dissatisfaction is medicated into oblivion. Suffice to say, society doesn't look great. The world isn't exactly glowing with hope. Young people are increasingly rejecting this society. They're rejecting the rat race and the hollowed out husk of a future that the Boomer generation left them. Young people are more and more looking to the West, metaphorically, and thinking about leaving all this garbage behind, like Holden, to build a cabin in the woods. Nevertheless, our own generation has proven itself eager to share in the condemnations of Holden Caulfield, and for much the same reason. In 2009, Schuessler wrote a rather scathing denunciation of the novel in the New York Times titled, Get a Life, Holden Caulfield. In it, she insists that modern teenagers don't talk about the things Holden talked about anymore. Sure, that sounds right. Modern teenagers aren't worried about people everywhere being fake. They aren't tired of rampant over-sexualization. They aren't struggling to find some point to their futures. They aren't disgusted by materialism. They don't admire genuineness or integrity. They aren't rejecting the educational rat race. Yeah. Okay, Jennifer. As is typical of boomers of every generation, because every generation has boomers, people like Jennifer Schuessler would have us believe that Holden Caulfield and Holden's present-day admirers are insane and aberrant for having problems with the nature of modern society. Like Peter Seng in 1961, Schuessler seems to think that drugging yourself and distracting yourself into accepting reality is the only real way to get a life. Schuessler even posited that Holden Caulfield might not have felt as alienated today. After all, he would have had a multi-billion-dollar entertainment super complex to keep him nice and distracted. Yeah, she really said that. I guess she missed the multiple times in the book he said he hated Hollywood because they were all phonies. Boy, I bet Schuessler loves TikTok. Feeling a little uncertain about society's ills? Here you go, the latest iPhone loaded with the best the world has to offer and brain-rotting slop served up in infinite quantities in the palm of your hand. There. I fixed Holden Caulfield. Her essay includes a collection of testimonials from teachers who insist that their students think Holden is lame. I'm sure they do. A surprising number of people every generation are just like Seng and Schuessler and several teenage characters in the book. They have no idea what Holden's issues were. They don't understand what it was that he hated so much about society. Funnily enough, I bet all of those teachers do have students who relate to Holden, despite the fact that they claimed they don't. Not that any of those teachers would have listened to them or paid attention to them and probably would have pretended they weren't there. After all, those are the problem children who probably just need a higher dose of slop and SSRIs. As Schuessler says, these days, teenagers seem more interested in getting into Harvard than in flunking out of Penn State Prep. Young people, with their compulsive text messaging and hyperactive pop culture metabolism, are more enchanted by wide-eyed, Quidditch-playing Harry Potter of Hogwarts. Maybe. But maybe that's also exactly what Holden was talking about. People these days, just as in Holden's day, are completely caught up in the rat race of, ooh, who's going to get into the good schools, and who's going to make the most money, and whose Instagram account is going to amass the most followers, and whose yoga pants are the tightest, and who has the most, whatever you call it, conquests on Tinder. And whenever that gets to feel a little empty, whenever the haze clears just a little and people look up and realize that, I don't know, inflation is so bad they're never going to be able to buy a house, or they're never going to be out of debt, or they're never going to be able to connect with another human being in real life, they can just plug themselves into the latest corporate slop to turn off their brains for a while, which is increasingly becoming just whatever the latest iteration of Harry Potter there is currently airing. Schuessler reads like someone who would have fit in well with the fake, narcissistic phonies whose eyes glazed over the second Holden tried to explain what he was thinking. A person whose primary interest is whether or not they're getting into Harvard while also reading Harry Potter for the 28th time is probably not Salinger's target audience, but rather is exactly the type of person who makes up the society that Salinger was critiquing. People like Schuessler mock Holden for wanting to go off and build himself a cabin in the forest. Meanwhile, they've got 7,485 pictures saved to their cottagecore Pinterest boards. Who's the fake, pretentious one here? She closes the essay with a triumphant mic drop, a quote from a 15-year-old student from Long Island. "Oh, we all hated Holden in my class. We just wanted to tell him, shut up and take your Prozac." I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same. A review published in 1951 when the book was released said that Holden's three-day tale was, quote, "in essence the tragic story of a problem child, unless, indeed, it's an indictment of a problem world," marking this as one of the only adult reviews of the book that glimpsed through the teenage swagger and relentless stream of consciousness of Holden's insightful, if childish, inner thoughts, and saw something else. Reading this book is like picking up a time capsule of what this part of the world was really like immediately after World War II. And I don't mean the celebrations and the euphoric, triumphant national pride. All of that was there, and none of it was bad, in all honesty. But underneath that, in the parts of the world that were mainly only seen by children, and mainly only children who, like Holden, were precocious and sensitive to hypocrisies and contradictions, there was growing something else. The world had changed with the two world wars. Society as it was prior to the First World War not only didn't exist anymore, it had faded from memory. But what society was going to become wouldn't really be visible until Holden's generation grew up, and even more so when their children grew up, and then too when their children grew up. The changes that Holden was noticing, details about the world that were ugly or worrying, these were set to doom future generations. But because Holden, and maybe even Salinger, couldn't know what we in 2026 know, these things came through then as little more than a simple, brutally honest story. But to us now, it's almost too chilling to read. Just as some more examples of these observations, the book is filled to overflowing with people who might talk to each other more than we do now, but it doesn't really matter because they don't listen to each other, making it basically the exact same as current year. There are people who only care about how they're seen or what image they're presenting to the world and whether or not they're admired or desired. Holden calls this behavior, of course, phony and despises it. But when people sacrifice their own ideals or their own principles in the name of this phony desire to be seen a certain way, it actually depresses him. People don't listen to each other. People don't connect. Sure, social media turned this problem up to 11, but it didn't create it. In one scene, when he tried to tell a girl he was with the troubling observations he'd made about the world, she repeatedly told him to stop shouting, despite the fact that he wasn't shouting, which indicated that she didn't want to hear it. Telling him to stop shouting was her way of telling him to shut up. He was saying things that were making her really uncomfortable because they were pulling back the veil of the world in which she had grown complacent and comfortable in her phoniness and her misery, and he needed to shut up. This pattern was repeated throughout the book. In the world of post-war America, a person's outward appearance, a person's social status was all anyone had. Culture and community were dying. Family was less and less important. Your bond with your spouse was less and less important. Your devotion to your children was less and less important. Friendships were mainly built on who impresses you with their material possessions, their things, their fancy cars or their club memberships, and who can get things for you, not on anything real. Every friend Holden tried to talk to in a genuine way, like the girl I mentioned before, didn't care about anything he had to say unless it gave them an opportunity to show off, or unless it bothered them. Narcissism had already taken hold. Social media would turn it into a monster, but the seeds of it were already sprouting in Holden's time, and seeing them made him miserable. Another fascinating and weirdly prescient observation made by Salinger with the story was mental health. Early on in the book, Holden recounts the events surrounding his beloved brother's sudden, shocking death from pneumonia. He tells the reader how that night he went out into the garage and punched out all the windows and even tried to punch out the windows in the car, injuring his hand. He didn't really remember doing it, and looking back on it, he thought it was a pretty stupid thing to do. But how did his parents react? Did they maybe try to talk to their son about the profound grief and shock he was feeling? Did they try to comfort him or help him find a healthy release for all the pent-up emotion that was smothering him? No, they wanted to send him to a shrink. Probably the shrink would medicate him, get him hopped up on some Quaaludes or whatever they were peddling in the 1950s before they had the magic cure-all, Prosium 2, SSRIs, and then he'd stop being so damn human, maybe turn into a nice docile zombie, and his parents would be able to focus on more important things, like themselves. This attitude toward parenting was just getting off the ground in the post-war era, but we can all see where it has led. Moreover, as I mentioned before, we found out in the beginning of the book that the events of these 3 fateful days have led to Holden being institutionalized in a sanitarium. Call me crazy, but I don't see anything particularly insane about him in the book, or even unstable. He wants to reject the miserable realities of society, leave school, and work to save up enough money to build his own cabin somewhere quiet and peaceful. Is that unrealistic? In 1951, definitely not. It might not directly address the pain he has in him, but it's a much better option than medication and institutions, I'll say that much. And it was an active solution. Imperfect, but it involved doing something with his hands in order to alleviate the helplessness that was crushing him. In current year, everyone in the world is running around talking about how we need to touch grass and get back to nature and real life. Maybe Holden was actually completely right about the solution, but as usual, no one listened to him. Plopping 16-year-old Holden in a sanitarium because he doesn't want to be exactly like all the fake drone pod people he sees every single day is borderline cruelty. But it's an example of what has been happening ever since then. A kid comes along who sees through all the, bullshit, and he has to be medicated and therapied until he's just like all of the other little drones. It's sad and kind of heartbreaking, but it has become the norm in modern society. Feeling a little unhappy with how terrible everything is? Here, have a pill. Feeling a little anxious about your future in a world where normal people will literally never be able to afford buying a house ever again? Here, have another pill. Feeling a little uneasy with the rampant over-sexualization out there? You're definitely going to need another pill. What was it that Marilyn Manson said? A pill to make you numb, a pill to make you dumb, a pill to make you anybody else. But all the drugs in the world won't save you from yourself. Holden has frequently been described as a brat who just needs to grow up. This is, I believe, meant to be spat in that particularly irritated way. Oh, you think it's dumb that adults lie to each other all day long? Just grow up. Oh, you think it's a little crazy how sexed up society is? Wow, kid, grow up. You think it makes no sense to work yourself to the bone at school just so you can drive a Cadillac, play golf at the club, and ignore your wife and kids like everyone else? Seriously, you need to grow up. We've been subjected for generations now to this idea that refusing to accept society as it is somehow a sign of immaturity. I know I was told this many times throughout my life. You don't like how it is out there? Well, grow up. Life's not perfect, sweetheart. Deal with it like a big girl. Weaponized indifference begets disenfranchised complacency, begets numbness, begets the Zoomer Doomer generation. Salinger didn't just see the writing on the wall. In a sense, he made the writing appear on the wall. The publication of The Catcher in the Rye brought out all these arguments about how Holden was some kind of a pathetic loser according to the norms and standards that would, in the future, produce an entire generation of Holden Caulfields. But there's hope in that. Holden Caulfield wasn't a zombie submitting meekly to his fate. That's why he became so beloved. He was resistant. He was trying to find an escape hatch. He failed, of course, because that's the tragic nature of his entire generation. The problems with society were not going to be fixed in 1951. They were going to get much, much worse. They were going to create the world we have today. But like Holden, the low desire generation, the Zoomers, are looking out at a sterile silicone world, the final form of phoniness, and they're rejecting it. Like Holden, they're throwing off the trappings of the society that wants to stifle and destroy them, turning them into drones and social media addicts and complacent wage slaves. Whether that's this massive rejection of smart technology, the resistance to entering corporate culture, the rejection of the meaningless four-year degree with a major in college, Zoomers are increasingly turning away, as Holden did, from what a mature adult is supposed to want to do. The tragedy of Holden was that he failed. But what he saw and why it bothered him possibly resonates even more with the current generation of young adults than it did when it was published. Near the end of the book, Holden tells his sister Phoebe what he can see himself becoming. I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in this big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids, and nobody's around. Nobody big, I mean, except me. And I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. I mean, if they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to come out from somewhere and catch them. That's all I do all day. I just be the catcher in the rye. In a way, that's exactly what Holden Caulfield became. And maybe it took a few generations, and maybe we lost a lot along the way, and maybe it had to get really bad first. But in time, people have begun to see it. Not just the problem, but the solution. And this book, with its observations and hidden tiny spark of hope, was very often the ray of light that helped people of our times understand what's wrong with our world and what we can do about it. And every time someone new opened the book and read it and related to Holden and felt their eyes opened and their minds change and filled with hope and light, Holden caught another one before they plunged over the cliff. And maybe that's the big secret. Maybe we're all supposed to help each other and try to stop each other from running off the edge of the cliff. If more of us did that, then maybe someday the world J.D. Salinger observed wouldn't exist anymore. If you love books and reading as much as I do, I invite you to join my book club. As of recording, we're nearly to the halfway point of our reading of Julian Grock's The Balcony in the Forest. It's a beautiful book, and there has been a lot of wonderful, fascinating conversation around it. If you'd like, do please join us. There's a link below with more information. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.